So we saw in the last video a little bit about how Buddhism emerges in Japan and some of the difficulties in those early centuries. And then we really focused on the Tendai group of Buddhist monks, a Mahayana group within Japan who was seeking to reform Buddhism within Japan and regain that spiritual focus. And we saw some of their emphases, the Lotus Sutra, the universal attainment of enlightenment, and the ultimate harmonization of all of the Buddha's teachings. So today, in this video, we're going to look at a couple of key figures in pushing new Japanese Buddhist movements. And each of them has a connection to Tendai because each of them was a Tendai Buddhist monk before departing and then pushing these new movements in Japanese Buddhism. So the first that we're going to look at is Honen. Honen, again, was a Tendai Buddhist monk, but he became frustrated because he didn't believe that the Tendai monks were doing enough to promote the universal attainment of enlightenment. Remember, that was one of their key themes, but he didn't think they were doing enough. They were up there in their mountaintop headquarters, and they weren't truly guiding all people toward enlightenment. So he actually left Tendai behind, left the monastery, and went back to China to see if there were other paths within Buddhism that truly did provide a more universal path to enlightenment. And of course, the group that he found in China was Pure Land Buddhism. And we already saw how Pure Land made its way from India to China, and we saw the emergence of Guanyin. Honen discovers Pure Land Buddhism in China and says, this is what I've been looking for, because Pure Land really does provide a universal attainment to enlightenment. And of course, that makes sense to us after studying Pure Land. It's all about having faith in the grace of the Buddha of the Pure Land. And that's something that anybody can do. You don't have to be a philosophical genius. You don't have to devote your entire life to meditation. This is something for everybody. So Honen sees it being practiced in China, learns all about it, and brings Pure Land back to Japan. And he's really the founder of Japanese Pure Land Buddhism. The basic structure will be the same. The name of the Buddha of the Pure Land in Japanese Pure Land is Amida, A-M-I-D-A. So oftentimes in America, for example, when we hear about Pure Land Buddhism, we hear the name of the Buddha of the Pure Land as Amida, Amida Buddha. So that's just going to be the more familiar name because of our connection more closely with Japan. So again, when I mentioned in that earlier video about Pure Land that I had gone to a Pure Land Buddhist worship service, and several of them in the Chicago area, I was always going to this particular Japanese Pure Land Buddhist temple. It was kind of meeting in an old abandoned church. And so everything was in Japanese, and I mentioned in that earlier video that while I don't speak Japanese, I knew that phrase of homage to the Buddha of the Pure Land in Japanese. Now, the Japanese name for that phrase that you're supposed to recite over and over again as an expression of your faith in the grace of Amida Buddha is the Nenbutsu. That's typed here for you. So the Nenbutsu is just finally a name that we're giving, the Japanese name for that one key phrase that is the major practice for Pure Land Buddhists. When you recite that phrase, homage to Amida Buddha, homage to Amida Buddha, over and over again as an expression of your faith, so that at the moment of death, that faith will be on your lips, it will be in your heart, and you will receive the grace to be reborn in the Pure Land. So the basic structure is the same, and yet here we see it emerge within Japan, where it remains to this day one of the most popular forms of Buddhism within Japan. I've mentioned one other figure here, Shinran, and Shinran was a disciple of Honen. So he was one of the early followers of Honen as Honen was establishing Japanese Pure Land Buddhism. And yet Shinran will eventually break from Honen and establish his own form of Pure Land. And one of the really interesting things about Shinran is that as a religious leader of his own form of Japanese Pure Land, he eventually gets married. And we can remember all the way back to our discussion of the early Ganji spiritual leaders like our Buddha. And one of the key differences between them and what we would call early Hinduism was that they wanted to focus on celibacy. That celibacy was the ideal. And even as Mahayana Buddhism came in and said that lay people can make real spiritual progress, there was still the ideal of celibacy, of being a monk or a nun, a religious leader who breaks away from all of those worldly pursuits in order to pursue nirvana. Shinran is one of the first throughout history to break from that notion of the ideal. And as a religious leader, he gets married. And this will forever shape Japanese Buddhism, because Japan is one of the very rare areas where religious leaders do not tend to practice the vow of celibacy. And many leaders of Japanese Buddhist temples will be leaders because they are the children of their fathers who were the leaders, and they will get married and then have children who will become the leaders of those religious temples. So it's a very unique practice within the world of Buddhism where you see Buddhist leaders getting married, having children, and that really begins with Shinran, a key disciple of Honen. The next name that I've given here is Nichiren. Nichiren also was a Tendai Buddhist monk studying on that mountaintop, trying to focus on those three key things. And yet he also leaves Tendai behind, but it's not for the same reason that Honen left it behind. He leaves it behind because he doesn't think that Tendai was focused enough on the Lotus Sutra, another one of its key themes, right? So Honen leaves because he doesn't think they're trying to give a path to all people. Nichiren leaves because they're not focused enough on the power of the Lotus Sutra. And Nichiren actually establishes his own form of Buddhism, which then gets named after him. So it is just called Nichiren Buddhism. And it becomes, again, very popular in Japan and will eventually spread around the world. And for Nichiren Buddhism, the Lotus Sutra is the absolute key to the spiritual path to nirvana. In some ways, Nichiren has a structure that is very similar to Pure Land. Remember Pure Land? You're focused on other power, receiving assistance from the other, which in the case of Pure Land is the Buddha of the Pure Land, to guide you along your spiritual journey. In Nichiren, you are also focused on other power, receiving assistance from another source. But here, the source is not another being like a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. It is the text itself, the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. So in Pure Land, think back, how do you receive that grace? Well, you recite that phrase, the Nembutsu, homage to Amida Buddha, over and over again to express your faith in the power of the Buddha to extend to you that assistance. In Nichiren, you do the same exact thing. You recite this phrase that means homage to the Lotus Sutra over and over and over again as an expression of your faith in the power of that teaching, the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. And by expressing your faith, that teaching itself is able to assist you and guide you. So the structure is very similar in the sense of a focus on other power, which we see in Pure Land, we see in Nichiren, and we see in other Mahayana movements. Not all of them. Remember, Chan or Zen was more about self-power. But here we see that other power in a very similar way between Pure Land, which emerges finally in Japan through Honen, and also in Nichiren, who started his own form of Buddhism focused on the other power of the Lotus Sutra. Both of these groups remain very popular for Japanese Buddhists to this day, and now we have a sense of how they emerged out of the Tendai movement that was existing in Japan by the end of the first millennium of the Common Era.